Celine.
Hi, AJ.
Hi, everyone. This is the Social Media and Tech Solidarity Podcast. My name is Amar Jean Christian. I'm here with Celine Semaan, who is an incredible woman who is an author, the founder of Slow Factory, a very popular organization that shares information about justice, colonization, and so many other things. You do so many things. I'm looking forward to getting into all of it. For those who don't know you, I was wondering if you could just start a little bit about who you are, maybe through your book, which just came out, A Woman is a School, and how it relates to your mission in life.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be in conversation with you. Um, A Woman is a School is essentially my memoir. It's a book about my lived experience in Lebanon, growing up in the war, the 35-year war and siege on Lebanon. And it really is really relevant when we're looking at it from the 1980s on what's happening right now. It's also the story of the person behind Slow Factory. So people may know Slow Factory, the organization, but may not know who started it. Why did we start it this way? What's the theory behind this organization? And at first I wanted to write an academic book, a sort of a practical book about my practice as a designer and the framework that we've developed at Slow Factory around designing frameworks for liberation, from media justice to design justice to all these other frameworks that we've developed. But I really felt that there was a need to tell a personal story because the work that I do comes from a lived experience. And the book also questions what's the value of a lived experience in academia, in the institution. How do we quantify or codify lived experiences from people of the global South who are surviving climate disasters, who are surviving ongoing occupation? What is this the value and the quality of their knowledge in comparison to more traditional frameworks that academia is interested in? So the book makes a case for what we categorize as lived experience and it's often discredited knowledge.
Yeah, I love that. It's so core to the theoretical concept that I use in my work, intersectionality, how people have very specific lives and live at the intersections of multiple systems of oppression, whether those be racial oppression, gender oppression, oppression based on where they live, whether they are colonial subject or whatnot, et cetera, as you know. And those stories are critical data, right, for understanding how the world works, right, and how we can make it a better place. And I just love how in your book, you really go very deep, right? Like you've lived quite a life, and you've gone through some really difficult times. But that is such a powerful story that helps us understand like what's actually going on in the world, right? How these empires are really deeply and frankly negatively affecting both people's lives, the climate, etc. And it seems like, yeah, I can see that in Slow Factory, right? Like there's something about what you've gone through in your life that seems like it's called you to share information, right, about what's going on, but always from this very grounded perspective, it seems.
Absolutely. I mean, the background that I come from is from an open knowledge sharing background. My past in my early 20s, my first positions were with the group Creative Commons. I was very active in the open web movement. And I was actually just writing a memo that's coming out this week that talks about, 12 years ago when Slow Factory started, Aaron Schwartz was driven to suicide after being harassed by the state for making scientific knowledge accessible to all. Although we hadn't met in person, him and I, we were peers. We both worked at Creative Commons. And Slow Factory is essentially the legacy of that work in sharing knowledge, the importance of making knowledge accessible, and also owning our own narrative, being the ones that are holding the knowledge and sharing that knowledge, as opposed to the ways in which philanthropy usually works, right? Like philanthropy in terms of knowledge sharing works from one way to another. Like we need to educate the global south. We are looked at as ignorant people who don't know how to govern themselves. Or oftentimes I heard these types of sentences where y'all don't know how to govern yourselves. You don't know how to live with one another, because we come from an area in the world that's known for wars. When you think of the Middle East, when you think of Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, you think of wars, you think of unrest, ongoing crisis, not just a climate crisis, but also a political crisis imposed upon us. We've survived thousands of years of colonialism and oppression, starting from the Roman Empire all the way to the Ottoman Empire. And right after the Ottoman Empire ended, the European colonizers came to chop up the land and separate it between themselves. So that's the lived experience that I'm talking about in my book, and that's the sort of narrative that we take control of and own and reclaim and use as a way to share knowledge with the rest of the world. And my practice as a designer, I see it a lot as a translator. I've translated complex information for the general public, whether it was in the interface design work that I've created with complex databases, all the way to complex information that touches on geopolitics and climate. So it's a work of translation. It's a work of explaining constantly to the other person that doesn't necessarily get it, this type of information, because knowledge on its own, data on its own, doesn't really have much value. As we say, there's a pyramid of knowledge that goes from data to information to knowledge to wisdom. I often share that in my classes on OpenEDU. OpenEDU being the body of work that we've created in 2020. So over close to 5 years of work in that space of peer-to-peer education.
Yeah, that's how I came in contact with Slow Factory. I think you had me do a lecture for OpenEDU, which seemed to be kind of a product of the pandemic. Maybe it was this like Zoom lecture. And I've given a lot of Zoom lectures. I had to teach during the pandemic, and I was kind of blown away. I think there were like well over 100 people in the Zoom, and it was the most active Zoom I've to this day ever been in. Like people were so engaged and like listening to every single word I was saying and making connections and sharing information amongst each other. And that idea of open knowledge was just very like obvious to me. And so that was like immediately I became a Slow Factory fan, because as an educator, if you can get people excited about learning, that is like the hardest thing in the world to do, but like you were so able to do it. So can you talk about the different ways that Slow Factory tries to create that environment of information sharing, knowledge sharing, and creating collective wisdom, and what you specifically focused on? You've talked a lot about climate justice, and you've talked a lot about the kinds of political violence. And one of the things I love about Slow Factory is that you make a connection between those two things, which is so rarely done.
Absolutely. So my background in blurring the lines between disciplines started long before I started Slow Factory. I'm an art student. I'm an artist, essentially. I was actually rejected from every single design school I applied to. And now the irony of it all is I teaching design to design schools that previously rejected me. So it's kind of funny. But the art of communicating education and turning education into a learning experience is what I think inspires me the most in being in this space. For Slow Factory, for example, it's not that we are saying we are the educators and we are going to teach you, but more like a relationship with the public, which you've experienced in OpenEDU, where this peer-to-peer relationship feels flat as opposed to from a hierarchy. It really feels like friends telling friends information rather than I'm the teacher and you must listen to me and this is how I'm going to talk to you about information. So there's a dialogue that occurs, whether it's by the chat. As you've seen, the chat is very, very on fire. and before the cohort you taught was basically 2-3 years after we had started the first year of Open EDU, we had about 5,000 students in the class at the same time, each class, which was unheard of. They broke the Zoom subscription that we had 3 times. We had to upgrade. We couldn't believe it, that there was such a hunger for education. There was such a hunger and need for what we call what school won't teach you. That's our slogan, what school won't teach you. And we tapped into that in a genuine way, because we are these people that didn't find our way into academia, that are sort of outsiders. We are also talking to a lot of misfits, if you will. So people that don't necessarily fit in a specific category, whether it's a scientific background or a fashion background or a marketing background or a storytelling background in the traditional sense. They're a bit of everything. They're basically this jack of all trades sort of person that's a misfit, that has many different talents, but that can't necessarily choose or tick a box of what they actually are. And I think that there's a growing community that feels that they are unable to fit in a specific box. So blurring the line between disciplines, it's not only needed to survive on this planet, because honestly, the ecosystem doesn't have these boundaries between different things that are occurring. And so it's only in academia that we're trying to categorize everything so neatly. In the real world, and what we are interested in is designing for the real world, which is a book that has been foundational for us at Slow Factory, along with Pedagogy of the Oppressed, another book that has also been foundational for us, is to design a sort of a cross-disciplinary framework. And because my background has been a fellow at MIT Media Lab during the time of redefining the Media Lab as an anti-disciplinary institution, this has brought me a lot of confidence into how my vision was to create this cross-disciplinary platform, and to also find confidence in it, to not feel like, oh, we're just being this outsider, creating outsider stuff, but to really see ourselves as an academic partner to academia. And slowly but surely we became that. Slowly but surely students would refer us to their professors. Universities would point to us as an additional framework or additional body of work that kind of bridges academia to the real world. And that's where Slow Factory finds its place.
Awesome. I think that maybe most people know about Slow Factory from your quite popular social media accounts. I mean, I followed on Instagram. Um, and so can you talk about how social media really plays into this education strategy? And to start, what's your social media origin story? Like, you're maybe around my age, and you've seen kind of social media grow up over the last 20 years. Um, when did you realize that social media was a thing you wanted to engage? And then talk about Slow Factory's social media strategy.
To be honest, I always I was always online from since the internet existed. I was in my teens. I was in Lebanon. My dad got the dial-up, and then we got online. I was on IRC channels from basically age 13, 12. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. 14, 15. I was like this teenager that came to age online, like it's like a coming of age online with peers, meeting strangers, and figuring out the internet by designing and coding and finding my way. When I turned 20, I went back to Montreal from Lebanon because my path has been flying around the world a lot. And when I went to Montreal to study, I realized I got basically invited to join a group of hackers. And my life started as part of the open web from a very young age, not being the best coder ever, because I wasn't, but being a designer, being someone who could translate, being someone who understood what was going on behind the scenes and could make it human, could make it intuitive, could make it accessible, could make it desirable, if you will. And so those skills were used at a very young age. I was able to dabble into that world and social media and, if you will, community-driven design, interactive design, all of these fields that started to emerge in the early 2000s. When Facebook happened, nobody wanted to be on Facebook. We didn't want Facebook. We all knew this was the privatization of the open web. We all knew what was going to happen. A lot of us refused to be on Facebook. I actually was forced to be on Facebook as part of an art residency because all the communications were happening on Facebook. I created an account, I think, in 2007. And I hated it. Like, I didn't want to be on this platform. Later on, when Instagram happened, again, I didn't want to be on Instagram, but someone was writing an article about Slow Factory and asked me what is the IG handle of Slow Factory. I think it was in 2012, and I didn't have one, and so I created it really quickly, and that's why it's the Slow Factory, because Slow Factory was already taken. It's actually a cake shop in Japan, and poor them, because once we get attacked, they get attacked. And I feel so bad for them because people just don't know that it's a cake shop. They just add Slow Factory. And basically, we never wanted to be on these platforms. We all knew they were harmful. We all knew that they were counterproductive to the movement. And we always used it as basically for fun, like we didn't really have a strategy. I always used design just to create things, and I never thought this was gonna be this way. I never thought that Slow Factory would grow. And in fact, when we were talking about Slow Factory, we never mentioned Instagram. We always talk about our programs. We talk about open education. We talk about what we do offline. We talk about what's happening in the organization. The organization was doing social media sort of like as a letting off steam. There was no strategy. We didn't think of it this way. And it grew because I think it's so genuine. It's so authentic. There's no marketing campaign behind it. There's no monetization behind it. There's literally none of those things. We don't even want to be on this platform. And so it's just using design for fun, literally letting off steam. Like, our team would be like, this is therapy. Like, the Instagram is therapy for us, so that we can let it off and then keep doing our work, and just say what we need to say and do our work. And whenever we spoke with foundations about fundraising and funding the work, we never mentioned IG. We never mentioned that we have a platform. We don't even talk about it until they asked us, and they were like, what is this? And we're like, oh, this is nothing. We don't even care about it. And they're like, no, this is something. This is something, and you have a media platform. And it was only after talking to you, actually, and talking to other people, where we realized that whether we like it or not, we are a media platform. Whether we want it or not, we are a media platform. We've always been that. It's time to own it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to share information online that's good information, that engages people. So many legacy organizations are trying to figure that out. And I think a lot of funders are like, journalism is in crisis. How do we save it? And in some ways, they look to you and they're like, oh, I see. This is journalism, but ways that like emerged naturally from this platform, as opposed to like trying to take something old and like putting it into a new platform. And so I see that tension where you're like, I'm interested in actually just like people sharing information in a decentralized, collective way. And this is just one way to do it, but you just do it so well that it's like kind of becomes something that you're known for. So I was going to ask you sort of how are these platforms serving you, but it seems like you have this kind of relationship with it where you're just like, I'd rather not be on it. So like,
100%.
what are the challenges that you're facing? What don't you like about these platforms?
Well, that's why we started everythingispolitical.com. It's launched this past year, 3 months ago. It's our platform. It's coded by our coders. It's not living on any other platform. It's outside of VC, outside of Meta, outside of X. What we don't actually, I just literally wrote a memo that's coming out this week. I'll send it to you if you want to attach it to this podcast. Essentially, I explain why these privatized platforms are dangerous for our freedom of expression. And in fact, they are affecting all of our freedoms, not just freedom of the press. They are manufacturing consent to continue the legacy of oppression around the world. They are manufacturing consent for genocide, in fact. what we don't like about these platforms is we are up against algorithms of oppression. We reach 40 million people per week in spite of these censorship frameworks that exist against us. Like, we have 880,000 followers. We should be at millions of followers by now. We get removed followers constantly. People follow us and it makes them unfollow us by default. It's constantly a challenge to be on these platforms. The other thing is that these platforms don't necessarily work in our favor. For instance, being so vocal targets us. This past year, we've received hundreds of death threats to my home, death threats to my cell phone. Like, people have found my cell phone. We've been doxxed. We've been heavily defunded. There's smear campaigns after smear campaigns. And I was just sharing with a friend earlier that Slow Factory has become this mysterious entity, a little bit like a Wizard of Oz, where people think we are a huge team behind the scenes because we're so rapid, like it's rapid response, right? We're doing rapid response, yet we are a small team. And in fact, we've been so heavily defunded that the past few months, it's just been me designing what you're seeing online. So it's just me posting on both platforms, designing and posting on top of the other work that I do. So it's a beast. It's a beast that I think I personally have a lot of love for. And I think a lot of people have a lot of love for, because it's the voice of the people. And our team that is now on standby, because we're fundraising to sustain the growth of the Slow Factory, our efforts are now on everything is political. But there is so much more that we can do, especially in these upcoming 4 years, if we have the support that we need for this public platform.
Yeah, I love you talked about all the challenges that I think a lot of people don't see when they just see a popular account and they think, oh, well, you got all these
But
followers.
they're rich. People think they're rich because it's good design. Since the beginning, people asked us for money all the time because it looks expensive. But it's because we're good designers. That's it. We're poor, good designers, and that's why it looks so good.
Yeah, yeah. And then I'm sure all those challenges around moderation that seems like largely algorithmic, right? Like these platforms are looking at the words that you're saying, the people who are following you, et cetera, and making assumptions about the kinds of things that you're talking about that might go against their quote unquote site guidelines, even though we've seen from other research that actually what seems to go according to against site guidelines often is in accordance with site guidelines. And actually, it's the people who send you hate that are violating the site guidelines. But for some reason, they don't get the same level of policing that
At
you're
all.
getting.
No, they're getting encouraged. In fact, especially now with this new law that they released, they removed the feature, which is essentially fact checking. So it's essentially facilitating, if you will, harassment and bullying online.
Yeah, I mean, you brought that up. That is something that's been in the news this past week. Everyone's talking about Mark Zuckerberg and Meta and how Meta is not only getting rid of fact checking, but seemingly making some other changes to how it moderates that seems to be allowing for more hateful, divisive content, as far as I can tell. Even interviews he's giving are kind of suggesting that, men are being oppressed, or the people who are in the majority are somehow being silenced on these platforms, which is wild to me because, of course, how do we have our president that's going to be inaugurated next week if men are being silenced? It just doesn't seem to make sense. And it seems like they're just trying to justify, oh, the political tides have turned. So now we need to support these people who've been in power forever, need somehow more power. I mean, are you concerned about, this isn't a question that wasn't in our prep list, so feel free to just say, I don't know, but are you concerned about where the political tides are turning and whether or not, even though these platforms have been already very difficult for you to operate in, that you might have to leave?
I hope that we don't get to leave, because they can easily shut down our accounts, and they've done so in the past. Okay, we've Now we have some allies internally at Meta, but they have shut down Slow Factory for 2 weeks in 2022, I believe. We were running a campaign raising awareness about deforestation in the Amazon rainforest and connecting the deforestation to the fashion industry, with over 100 brands involved in the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. It was a big report. That week, we got shut down for 2 weeks. So our campaign got delayed. And eventually the account was restored. So with a click, they can just delete us. And hopefully they don't, because us being there is super important, I think, because we need to be there. We really need to be there. That being said, our eggs are not all in one basket anymore. And we have been decentralizing and putting our efforts into EIP. What we call EIP is Everything is Political. And EIP as a new platform that has the power to decentralize away from VC funded, or at the very least Meta X fascist funded platforms. These types of independent media platforms need to be supported and need to be nurtured in the next 4 years, because they are going to be holding communities. Right now, we're seeing a ban on TikTok happening in 6 days from now. The ban on TikTok is creating a lot of drama, if you will, on TikTok. For those of you who are on TikTok, there's been a lot of tears, a lot of goodbyes. It feels like summer camp basically is ending, and people don't know where to go. They're downloading other Chinese apps. If we can invite them to join EIP, at the very least, finding community is going to be the most important thing in the next 4 years, because the reason why TikTok is being banned is because it's much more efficient for the ruling class to have communities segregated from one another. And to have communities isolated, to have people isolated, so that there's a sense of fear, there's a sense of disconnect. And that's what we don't want, right? So we're there just to hold our community, essentially. And we're also creating an adjacent community, inviting people to join us so that we can continue this very important work of mobilizing, educating, and just providing hope and providing a sense of community.
Yeah, I think that's what we've really lost, is that sense of community. I think, I remember the early days of social media, and it could feel like community. Oftentimes you were connected to people that you knew in real life. And that's how humans have developed for thousands of years, is that our community are the people that we know in real life, that we are connected to, because we have these like really intimate cultural associations, social connections. And then social media comes on, and because they took all this VC funding, they have to scale. And so now you have platforms that have tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of users. And we've not developed practices to have a community of 1 billion people. And it creates these kind of broadcasting dynamics where individuals think about themselves as a corporation that's like a brand that has to like market themselves. And I do think that there's this tension that you're underlying with the potential demise of TikTok, which is, on the one hand, people found such connection and community there. On the other hand, that platform got so big so fast, maybe people were interacting with it and engaging with it in a way that was kind of like television versus like you said, something more intimate, where we're here for an intentional reason. And it seems like what you're trying to do with Everything is Political is, much smaller scale, but maybe hopefully a little bit deeper in terms of the kinds of engagement. That's not about like celebrity culture or popularity, but is about like, hey, we share a certain set of values. Let's share information so that we can co-create the world that we want to see. So I really want to ask you about like, what is your strategy behind Everything is Political? How are you developing the protocols, practices, and this platform that can maybe shift how people engage with media? Like, I know there is like a physical kind of magazine publication. So I love the kind of return to like tactility and something that is more kind of intimate that you can hold in your hands. But it seems like there's other stuff beyond that as well.
Yes, absolutely. So what I am not afraid of is starting small, and starting small, as you said, being able to have this more intimate relationship with people and set the tone of how this community is going to be moving forward, and designing the scalability of that community based on these ethics and this culture that has been created, and purposefully starting small, purposefully not allowing everybody in from the beginning, and purposefully editing and curating that. And also the strategy of having a physical newspaper, and really going back to a newspaper, first of all, because it's the cheapest form of printing, and it's like at a time we have thousands of copies that we're distributing in, versus a magazine that's a bit more glossy, a bit more expensive, a bit longer. So the EIP, Everything is Political, puts out a newspaper every month. So there's already a lot of content that's being made for that. And in starting small, we're not afraid to scale as well, okay? Because it's important not to be afraid of big numbers. So when we reached, let's say, 500,000 followers on IG, we all had a panic attack. We were like, oh my God, because we also started so small, and we were so shocked of the response of like how many people cared and wanted this. So for EIP, the design of it growing and scaling is a protocol that we're approaching as well, and a framework that we're approaching, where we're looking at the members becoming sort of having equity along the with the platform, like receiving equity, becoming more like partners of this platform eventually, because what we don't want is to lose the community with the scale. So a lot of other platforms that we've worked on, whether my partner and I, he's an engineer, I'm a designer, we've worked on several platforms before we started Slow Factory. And what often happens is that, as you said, VC comes in, and then scaling becomes at the expense of culture and ethics. It's just scaling for funding. It's just scaling. And then people lose their stakes into the company. They lose control over the company. That's something we don't want to see in EIP. You do scale because you need money to support the sort of infrastructure that holds this community. Servers, like it's expensive to hold this type of content. This content actually needs servers. Servers need space. It's funding. Like there's something that at a certain point I can't just pay for on my own. We have to share the cost of this infrastructure that we're building. And we want to share it in a way where we don't have to sell data. We don't have to sell ethics. We don't have to sell ads either. I don't want it to become this ad pizza where you have pop-ups after pop-ups as you're reading something. That's the worst experience that I really hate designing. So that's why I'm no longer a design for corporations, because, the past decades, I really didn't want to put my design work anymore into these sticky, unethical platforms. And I wanted to put it towards, what do we want to create? What do we want to build? So in that way, EIP becomes this labor of love and of ethics that we are designing in a way that it could scale. We could share profit. We can become co-owners, essentially, working with series of DAOs into how do we continue scaling where the community becomes the owner. Like it's shared ownership of this platform. So it's still a work in progress. We have about 1,500 subscribers now. We just started 3 months ago. So it's just about how do we scale and how fast do we want to scale.
I love that. Yeah, the question of scaling, how do you do it? How quickly do you do it? Who do you do it with?
Mm-hmm.
So critical. And the focus and intention on those questions is very hard to do when there's a lot of capital at stake up front, right? But I love how you're talking about building capital collectively in a decentralized way over time with the people who you want to also share and consume that content, right? So they can hold you accountable to your values over time. I do think over the next couple decades, we're going to realize that this is the way that we should be developing technology. It should be in community. We can't just hand over all those responsibilities to corporations and then expect that it's going to be good for the culture,
To
right?
one individual, or to one individual, like, for example, a Zuckerberg who desperately wants to look like one of us, but is definitely not one of us. And we want to remain for example, Slow Factory, often we joke behind the scenes that it's basically like the people's princess, like Lady Diana. We often joke that like Slow Factory is the people's princess because we exist because the people believe in Slow Factory, fund Slow Factory. We're not funded by big foundations, as you know. We don't have big funders. It's literally people funded public service, essentially. And so as we create this platform and we want to grow, we want to continue being the people's princess, if you will, and having it be that people hold this platform in a way that, as you defined it so well, decentralizes it from this technocracy that we're seeing right now.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if you have an answer to this, but I'm curious what other communication technologies or platforms have been useful in your work. We're in this place where it seems like in order to create the world we want, we have to use what exists, right? Like you use Instagram, even though you'd probably rather not, because it's a platform that everybody's on. And so that's where you can access your community. What other things are you using to support Slow Factory, in as much as you can say publicly, that would not put you at risk, of course?
No, of course, we are on TikTok, on X, Twitter. We've always been on Twitter. It's been since the beginning. I mean, the first platform I joined was Twitter before, back in the day in the early 2000s when it started. Before that, I was on Flickr. Of course, that's our IP. But we're no longer on Flickr. We're on TikTok and X. On YouTube, we have a channel on Vimeo for all the Open EDU classes. All the videos are there. We work closely with Vimeo right now. And, we are offline as well. So you'll find us in guerrilla spaces. For instance, we had trucks driving around New York City and all the cities. Actually, we had DC, we had Atlanta, we had LA, these trucks, these billboard trucks with our messages were just driving around. We had billboards. We also released posters that people printed and we pasted around. So the street art / guerrilla / we're outside of the digital spaces. It's also super important. We run a lot of screenings, talks, events. We have a conference series and a music festival that we do as well every year. So we are also offline as much as possible.
Yeah, I love that. I love an offline online strategy. It's something that I used when I started my company as well. We had a in-person event in the city before we put anything online. We got our community's buy-in in person to just get a check of like, should we post this? Like, do you like this? And also like, let's connect and like actually build capacity where we are. So I just think that is so key. And I just love that you do that because I feel like so many, Instagram accounts or X accounts don't do that, right? But it seems like your skepticism of these platforms partially motivates that. You want to have some other base of community power that's not connected to platforms that you don't control, even though it seems like you're on most of them, which is pretty remarkable. I love that kind of holding of the contradiction of these are not platforms that serve us, but they're where our community is. So we've got to meet them where we are and do the best we can with what we have while we slowly build the world we need. So that's tech platforms, but I want to ask you about cultural protocols. It's kind of term that I use and other people use, like ancestral practices, rituals, even values, or even when you show up in space, things like, food as technology or, agreements or things like that. Are there things that you use to ensure that your community feels secure and safe and brave in sharing space wherever you and Slow Factory show up?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And I love the terminology. And I always learn so much from you in terms of the language, because we do things that are very intuitive, but then we don't know what they're called, And so there's a gap because we don't come from philanthropy that we're like, we're doing that, but we don't know what it's called. So thank you for that. We have a free lunch series called Liberation Lunches that started since October 2023 because a lot of us Arabs felt like we couldn't eat, watching our people being forcefully starved. And so we started this with a group of Arab peers from the Slow Factory community, and Slow Factory hosted and funded these liberation lunches, and we hosted them from our culture, like how we host in our culture. So for instance, they're very long lunches. You're going to eat a lot. There's going to be food for everybody's, dietary restrictions. And again, just going back to the book and the framework in the book of explaining and embodying the cultural traditions from our region, if you will, in hosting, in holding space for our community, in collective care and collective healing practices. And so food is an ancestral practice for us. And because we couldn't eat on our own, we felt so isolated. We wanted to host. And often, because we're raised in a collectivist culture, it's very hard to feed yourself, but it's so much easier to cook for friends. So that's basically where this lunch series started. And it's continuing now with my book. So I'm doing a dinner series for A Woman is a School. It's the first one is on January 30th. I'm very excited to partner with Levantine restaurants that want to host us, because it's just this generosity. In my book, there's a chapter about radical generosity. It's this type of generosity in our culture that is sort of the protocol that Slow Factory is built around, is to always give more than you receive, because this is the way in which our culture has always been, it has always existed. And in the West, it was just a recipe for disaster because we were always taken advantage of. But when we are with our community, we can actually be giving because others are also giving. And it's this culture of generosity. And in the book, I talk a lot about it as competition, generosity competition, where you want to give more than the other and you're constantly thinking about how you can give more. And it's very Middle Eastern. I'm sure other cultures relate in the Global South, because I think the Global South is built that way across the board. One of my dearest friend is Indian, and we talk a lot about this competition, generosity between each other. Like, you gave me a dress, I'm going to give you a book. You gave me a book, I'm going to invite you to dinner. And it's just constantly giving. And that's the framework that Slow Factory is built upon. And that we encourage reciprocity as part of our exchanges. Whichever way. So our events are always free, but we always encourage reciprocity in any way that the person can contribute to. So maybe sometimes it's a connection, sometimes it's a donation, sometimes it's an invitation into using their spaces. So it's built on these values that are dear to our hearts, that make us who we are as humans. And I talk a lot about it in the book, A Woman is a School.
Yes, I love that so much. It's something that is, I think, indigenous to so many cultures. And you'll see in my book, I talk about the cookout as a Black American ancestral practice of giving that I think does have roots in various kinds of African traditions that are similar, even like susu or juke dancing circles, etc., where we come together and collectively we have more kind of nourishing than we can individually. But like you said, that can be co-opted and used by extractive systems to take that profit away, right? To kind of make money off of that generosity. And it's this tension that we hold in every space that we create. And it's something that we need to continually remind ourselves is like, we have to kind of do it a little bit differently. Otherwise, we are going to be exploited. We have to create these spaces where we are protected from those systems of exploitation and extraction in as much as we can, because it's impossible in this society to be completely divorced from having your generosity taken advantage of. But it's something that we still need to do. It's a practice. And so I want to ask you a very specific question, two very specific questions that I hope you have answers for, but it's okay if you don't. What is one specific thing, a cultural practice like this, a design feature, a platform policy that you would love about social media or other technology that you use in your everyday life? And then what's one thing that you would change? What's one thing on your own social media platforms, like Everything is Political, or on the social media platforms that you're on, that you think works with your practice? And then one thing that you would change. We maybe talked a lot about the things that we'd change, but I want to get like a kind of clear, solid answer.
what's the one thing that works for us, basically, that works for us in the current platforms. I think what works for us is this ability to reach so many people at the same time using design, and being able to basically disseminate information at a rapid pace because it's visual. So before, the internet was mostly text, and uploading an image was so heavy, and it was not as easy. And what works now is that got better in uploading video and images, and it's lighter and faster, and these images travel really, really far. And that works for us to be visual, like visual based technology, because it helps go beyond language barriers, and it helps also go beyond geographies.
Yeah, I think that like that visual nature is so important in like these kinds of especially crisis moments. And it feels like for the past few years, it's just been kind of one crisis after another and multiple ones overlapping. And so people are kind of overwhelmed with information. And so the visuals seem like to grab people's attention and say, hey, pay attention to this. This is important.
Yes, and to also the ways in which we work at Slow Factory is to develop this design language that now you could see has been adopted by the majority of accounts, which at the start of it, close to 10 years ago, in fact, we started using Helvetica and these very simple fonts because we wanted to create a highway of information and not have decorations and any other distractions. And the choice of fonts, the choice of colors were were studied. I made that decision designing the language of Slow Factory's, the design language of our posts, so that we can be faster in the sharing of that knowledge, so that there would be no barriers to entry into people's minds, no distractions, just read the information, essentially. I hesitated between using Interstate as a font or Helvetica. Interstate is the font that's used on the signs, the road signs everywhere in America. So it's like a very simple font. You just read the font and you know where to go. Or Helvetica. And I went with Helvetica because of it allowing me more freedom in terms of design, and it being largely used by the West. I wanted to co-opt a language from the West to tell our stories in a way that wouldn't have any language barrier involved into them. Now we've changed the font to a specific font that we use, but you can see the entire internet using Helvetica, using and like borrowing from the Slow Factory's design language. I get so many DMs being like, this looks like Slow Factory, this looks like Slow Factory daily. At first, it was making us extremely sad because we were hoping people will build upon the design language rather than stealing the design language and creating confusion. But in just zooming out, looking at what we've created, this is our legacy. This is what we're contributing to the commons. This design language that's now becoming the norm when you're talking about activism, you know that's coming from Slow Factory, and it continues to be exploited, sadly, but we continue to innovate and we continue to use all other things that later on you see being adopted. So for example, we started introducing handwriting. We started introducing drawings, hand drawings. And now, like, a lot of people are now handwriting on their things, as well as using Helvetica. So collage, then we started using collage. Everybody, collage, Helvetica, handwriting. Like, you understand the kind of composition that I'm talking about, that has become this sort of toolbox for the activist designer that wants to talk about their causes. And that's one of our contributions.
I love that. I love that. I love that you're just kind of giving people a little bit of a design 101 education right now about how to think about clear communication, especially in an information saturated environment, right? You're designing for a specific environment. That is one where people are bombarded with images all the time. So they have to, in a different environment, you might be able to use different kinds of fonts and colors and be more kind of mishmashy or kind of artistic in some ways. But, that's not for
I can give a
Instagram.
whole class about the design language, how we use lo-fi, low fidelity, like memes, purposefully use pixelated photos, all the way to high fidelity and illustrations, crafted maps, maps that we're drawing ourselves, graphs that we're drawing ourselves. So lo-fi and hi-fi, like we always talk about that at Slow Factory, and a mix of in between in the design language that doesn't get the public fatigued into seeing the same thing all the time. So we vary, and the design language is very robust and has been developed over the course of the past, decade, if you will, being web native from the start. So we grew up on the internet and then playing with all of this culture all the way till now with the mimification of our culture and the mimification also of the revolution and all of the stuff that we're talking about. And how do we use memes in an ethical way?
Oh, wow. Just a whole separate conversation that unfortunately we can't get to, but I do want to make sure we get to, if you could change anything about these platforms, what would you change if you were designing your own Instagram from scratch, or even how you're thinking about designing the many other platforms that you continue to design? What are some of the design features, or again, those kind of cultural protocols or whatever that you think people should know about that you would change?
So right now we are designing a new platform that's a hybrid between X, Substract, and IG, I would say, in a way that it is a publication platform. And what we are allowing is more tools. Essentially, like, for example, on Instagram, you post a picture. Let's say there's a typo. And there's always a typo, especially if I'm designing. English is my third language. There's always a typo. Okay, disclaimer. So there's a typo. I want to change the image. I wish I could just take the image down and re-upload an image and it stays in the same post because it already has the community around it. And I wish I could respond in that way. It would create less outrage, because believe it or not, people get so pissed that we have typos sometimes, or we forgot a word. For instance, recently we shared something regarding eucalyptus trees. And we said eucalyptus trees are a symbol of colonialism. I wish I could just, download that image and re-upload it. In the United States was missing. Because, of course, Australians were like, no, it's not. But it's not. We're talking about the US. I had to add in the United States in the caption, because we're so global. Like sometimes you think you're just talking to a certain audience and you're surprised that you're actually reaching the entire world with one image. So that would be a feature I would like to code into the editing images and minimizing the outrage.
Yeah, it's that context collapse, like we were saying. We as humans are not evolved to talk to 1 billion people at once. Like that's kind of like a really big ask to make of any individual or organization. And yeah, just a little bit more grace in terms of allowing people to make edits, because
1000%.
it's a complex
More grace.
conversation. It would help us be more gracious with each other, right? Like I think that's what you're kind of saying, that like
I feel like, yeah, and that's why physical events, in-person events, IRL events are so important, because when you read the comments and they're anonymous, people talk to you like they're a bunch of Karens, like they want to talk to the manager all the time. They'd want to talk to the manager. There's a punitive energy that comes with it. There's an accusation before they even understand. There's zero grace. There's just a download. It's essentially, I make a comparison that our comment section, it's like a public bathroom in a shitty bar. Everybody's pissing around the toilet. Everyone's writing their graffiti. It's awful. But in-person events, we never have this type of interaction, ever, ever. It's always, met with so much love, so much respect, so much grace, human to human. And that's missing in the comment section. It's missing in that reach, is that the grace and the humanity of people is kind of lost in this comment section that turns to become a trashy bathroom, honestly, sometimes bad.
100%. It's so interesting how these hyper-capitalistic platforms end up replicating the carceral logics of
that part.
colonialism. You know, it's just how those things are so intertwined and how it has really been so harmful to our communities that are just kind of, again, we're just not used to. We're not, that's not what is good for us design wise, right? And we definitely need platforms that are just oriented differently, that just have us talking to each other as we would in space. So more to come, because everyone on this podcast is going to be talking about how are we designing alternatives, how are we creating the world that we need through existing platforms. All is not lost. There are people who, like Celine, are doing the work of co-creating a new world. And for that, I want to thank you so much for this incredible interview. Just the way that you think about things, the richness of your experience, the breadth and diversity of your work. I'm sure we didn't even talk about all the things that you and Sub Factory did in this hour, but I hope we got to at least some of the core things. Thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with me.
Thank you so much. This was so invigorating and interesting, and I love talking to you. It's always it allows me to understand more what we do, because as I said, we really work from a place of heart, and we have very little analysis as we go. And it's always so helpful to talk to you to just understand more the breadth of this work. And I just want to add one more thing, is that the comment section are super important. I would never remove them because they're always a place to learn. It's just what's missing, sadly, is this grace that we're talking about. So more grace.
Absolutely. No, we love the comment section, but we love a comment section with intention, with community values at its core.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and I'll see you in a few months.
Yes, see you soon. Thank you so much for having me.